The morning mist had just begun to lift from the gardens of Thornfield Manor when Lady Isabella Fairmont received the letter that would shatter 6 years of carefully maintained peace and anonymity. The royal seal on the correspondence made her hands tremble as she recognized the distinctive sapphire blue wax that could only come from one source: Prince Alexander Montclair, Crown Prince of Valdoria, and the man whose absence from her life had been both blessing and torment since the day she had fled the capital with his son, growing in her womb. The year was 1847, and the small kingdom of Valdoria, nestled between France and the German states, had become a crucial player in European politics, its strategic position making Crown Prince Alexander one of the continent's most sought-after diplomatic figures. His marriage negotiations with various European princesses had been the subject of court gossip for years, while his personal life remained shrouded in the kind of mystery that only enhanced his political value in international matrimonial alliances. Lady Isabella had followed these developments from the safety of her self-imposed exile in the English countryside, where she had built a quiet life, raising the son whose existence Prince Alexander had never suspected. 6-year-old Thomas possessed his father's striking blue eyes and regal bearing, but his world consisted of Latin lessons with the village priest, riding instruction from the local stablemaster, and bedtime stories that carefully omitted any mention of his true heritage. "Mamma," Thomas said as he burst into the breakfast room, with the energy that characterized his approach to each new day, "Mr. Pemberton says I ride better than boys twice my age. Can we visit the Abbey ruins this afternoon? I want to practice the sword work you've been teaching me." Isabella felt her heart tighten with both pride and pain as she observed her son's natural aristocratic bearing and instinctive command presence, qualities that marked him unmistakably as Prince Alexander's heir, despite 6 years of careful concealment. Every day brought new evidence that Thomas was growing into someone whose capabilities and character would eventually demand more than the quiet country existence she had created for them both. "Perhaps after your lessons with Father Benedict," she replied, with the loving attention that had characterized every aspect of Thomas's upbringing. "Your education must take precedence over recreation, even when recreation involves such important skills." The letter in her hands seemed to burn with import as she contemplated whether to read correspondence that could only bring demands she was not prepared to meet. Prince Alexander's silence for 6 years had allowed her to hope that their brief but passionate affair had been forgotten amid the political pressures that governed royal marriages. But the formal weight of this communication suggested that hope had been naive. When she finally broke the seal and read the carefully worded but unmistakably imperative contents, Isabella felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around the foundations she had thought were secure. "Lady Isabella," the letter began in Prince Alexander's familiar, precise handwriting. "Recent intelligence has brought to my attention circumstances regarding your departure from Valdoria that require immediate clarification. I am informed that you may possess information regarding matters of dynastic importance that affect the security and succession of the crown. You are commanded to present yourself at Montclair Palace within the fortnight, prepared to discuss these matters with the full authority and discretion that such sensitive topics demand. Failure to comply will necessitate more direct methods of obtaining the clarification that duty requires. Alexander, Crown Prince of Valdoria." The formal language could not disguise the underlying message. Someone had discovered Thomas's existence and informed Prince Alexander that he had a son whose illegitimate status could either strengthen or destroy his political position, depending upon how the revelation was managed. Isabella's mind raced through the implications of discovery that she had spent 6 years dreading. If Prince Alexander acknowledged Thomas as his son, the boy would be drawn into a world of political intrigue and dynastic pressure that could destroy the carefree childhood she had worked so hard to preserve. But if he rejected Thomas's claim to royal blood, their son would grow up knowing that his own father had denied him for political convenience. "Mamma," Thomas said with growing concern as he noticed her obvious distress, "you look pale. Are you feeling unwell?" "I'm quite well, sweetheart," Isabella replied with effort to maintain the calm composure that had become second nature during years of protecting him from truths too complex for a child to understand. "Just correspondence that requires careful consideration." But even as she spoke the reassurances, Isabella was calculating possibilities for escape that would protect Thomas from whatever demands Prince Alexander might make. 6 years of peaceful exile had made her forget the reach of royal authority and the impossibility of hiding from someone whose resources included the intelligence networks of an entire kingdom. The morning's routine continued with determined normalcy. Thomas's Latin lesson with Father Benedict, his riding instruction with Mr. Pemberton, and the geography studies that Isabella personally supervised to ensure her son received education appropriate to his intelligence rather than merely his supposed station. But beneath the familiar activities lay growing tension as she realized that their idyllic existence was ending, whether she complied with Prince Alexander's summons or attempted continued flight. Lady Isabella, Mrs. Whitmore, her housekeeper, announced during the afternoon, "There are gentlemen at the main gate who claim urgent business requiring your immediate attention. They carry documents that appear to bear official seals." The announcement confirmed Isabella's worst fears. Prince Alexander had not been content to wait for her voluntary compliance, but had sent representatives whose authority would make refusal impossible. Looking out the manor's windows toward the approaching riders, she could see the distinctive blue and gold livery that marked them unmistakably as members of the royal guard. "Thomas," she said with forced calm, as her son played with toy soldiers in the sitting room, "I need you to go to your room and begin packing your traveling clothes. We may need to take a journey very soon." "Where are we going?" Thomas asked with 6-year-old curiosity rather than alarm, his sheltered existence having taught him that travel meant adventure rather than danger. "To visit someone very important who has requested our company," Isabella replied with careful honesty that prepared him for significant changes without revealing the full scope of what they would face. As Thomas departed to pack with the excitement that characterized his approach to new experiences, Isabella prepared to meet representatives of the man whose love had given her the greatest joy of her life, while whose duty now threatened to destroy everything she had built to protect that joy from the consequences of royal politics. The brief affair that had resulted in Thomas's conception had been conducted in absolute secrecy during her service as companion to Prince Alexander's elderly aunt, Princess Marguerite. Their attraction had been immediate and overwhelming, leading to stolen meetings that had provided respite from the political pressures that governed every other aspect of his existence as heir to the throne. But when Princess Marguerite's death had ended Isabella's position at court, she had discovered her pregnancy just as Prince Alexander's engagement to Princess Sophia of Bavaria was being finalized for diplomatic reasons that served Valdoria's foreign policy objectives. Rather than burden him with personal complications that could destroy carefully negotiated international alliances, Isabella had chosen exile that protected both his political future and their child's right to grow up free from the constraints that would define any acknowledged royal bastard's existence. Now, 6 years later, that sacrifice was about to be tested by demands she had always known might eventually come, but had hoped to delay until Thomas was old enough to understand and participate in decisions about his own destiny. The men who approached Thornfield Manor carried themselves with the disciplined bearing that marked them as elite guards rather than mere messengers, their presence indicating that Prince Alexander viewed her compliance as essential rather than merely desirable. As Isabella prepared to face whatever ultimatum they carried, she understood that her carefully maintained anonymity was ending, and that the choices she made in the coming hours would determine not just her own future, but the kind of life her son would live as his royal heritage was finally acknowledged. The secret she had guarded for 6 years was about to be exposed, but whether that exposure would prove to be liberation or destruction remained to be determined by forces beyond her control and decisions that would test everything she believed about love, duty, and the price that both could exact from those brave enough to choose between them. The confrontation with Prince Alexander's representatives took place in Thornfield Manor's drawing room, where Lady Isabella received Captain Henrik Rothschild and Lieutenant Marcus Beaumont with the dignity that 6 years of exile had not diminished, despite circumstances that made her feel like a criminal being arrested for crimes she had committed out of love rather than malice. Captain Rothschild, a man whose 40 years of royal service had given him extensive experience with delicate family matters that required both discretion and absolute authority, presented his credentials with the formal courtesy that barely concealed the gravity of his mission. "Lady Isabella," he said with diplomatic precision that revealed nothing of his personal opinions about the situation, "His Royal Highness has commanded me to escort you and the child to Montclair Palace, where matters of dynastic importance require immediate resolution. "The child has a name," Isabella replied with protective firmness that surprised both guards with its quiet authority. "Thomas is not merely the child. He is a 6-year-old boy whose welfare must be considered in whatever arrangements you believe necessary." "Of course, my lady," Captain Rothschild agreed with professional courtesy that suggested understanding of her maternal concerns. Prince Thomas's welfare is indeed His Royal Highness's primary consideration in requesting this meeting. The casual use of royal title for Thomas struck Isabella like a physical blow as she realized that Prince Alexander had not merely discovered his son's existence, but had already begun the process of claiming him as legitimate heir, whose status would transform both their lives permanently. "Prince Thomas," she repeated with growing alarm at implications that went far beyond simple acknowledgement of paternity. "Captain Rothschild, surely you understand that Thomas has never been recognized as royal heir and has no legal claim to such titles." "Lady Isabella," Lieutenant Beaumont interjected with obvious discomfort at having to explain dynastic law to someone whose position made such discussions awkward. "Legitimization of royal offspring requires only official acknowledgement by the reigning monarch. Prince Alexander's recognition of his son's patrimony would indeed grant Prince Thomas full royal status." Isabella felt her carefully constructed world shifting as she began to understand that this was not merely about Prince Alexander learning of Thomas's existence, but about political necessities that might require acknowledging his illegitimate son as heir to secure succession that served Valdoria's interests. "And if I refuse to bring Thomas to court?" she asked with growing desperation at possibilities that seemed to offer no acceptable alternatives. "Lady Isabella," Captain Rothschild replied with gentle firmness that made clear the futility of resistance. "His Royal Highness's request was not phrased as a suggestion subject to your approval. Prince Thomas's presence at court has been commanded by royal decree that carries the full authority of the crown." Before Isabella could respond to this clarification of their true legal position, Thomas himself appeared in the drawing room doorway with the fearless curiosity that had characterized his approach to new experiences throughout his sheltered childhood. "Mama," he said with 6-year-old directness that ignored the obvious tension in the room, "these gentlemen have very fine horses and uniforms. Are they here to take us on our journey to visit the important person you mentioned?" The innocence in his voice broke Isabella's heart as she realized that Thomas had no understanding of how completely his life was about to be transformed by forces beyond his control or comprehension. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied with effort to maintain composure for his sake. "Captain Rothschild and Lieutenant Beaumont have come to escort us to meet someone who is very eager to make your acquaintance." "Is he a friend of yours?" Thomas asked with natural curiosity about adult relationships that governed his small world. Isabella hesitated, uncertain how to explain a connection that had been the most meaningful relationship of her life, but had remained secret for 6 years due to circumstances that a child could not be expected to understand. "He is someone I knew before you were born," she said finally with careful honesty that prepared him for complexity without overwhelming him with details inappropriate for his age. Captain Rothschild, observing this exchange, clearly recognized both Isabella's genuine devotion to her son and Thomas's remarkable composure for a child facing such dramatic changes to his routine. "Prince Thomas," he said with the respectful address that royal protocol demanded regardless of the boy's current status, "your mother has told you about taking a journey. Are you prepared for travel that might last several weeks?" "I'm always prepared for adventures," Thomas replied with confidence that impressed both guards with its natural authority. "Mama says that learning new things and meeting new people makes us stronger and wiser." The philosophical maturity in his response suggested education that went far beyond what most 6-year-olds received, demonstrating Isabella's commitment to preparing him for whatever future circumstances might require, despite her hopes that such preparation would prove unnecessary. Over the following hours, as Isabella and Thomas packed belongings for what she feared might be permanent departure from the only home her son had ever known, both guards observed interactions that revealed the depth of their mutual devotion while confirming reports about Thomas's remarkable capabilities and character. "Lady Isabella," Captain Rothschild said during a private moment while Thomas was occupied with selecting books for their journey, "I hope you understand that His Royal Highness's interest in the boy stems from genuine concern for his welfare rather than mere political calculation." "Does it?" Isabella asked with bitter recognition of how royal duty typically overrode personal sentiment when succession and dynastic interests were concerned. Captain Rothschild, I have spent 6 years protecting Thomas from exactly the kind of political pressures that royal acknowledgement would bring into his life. How can I believe that sudden paternal interest serves his needs rather than the crown's convenience? Because, Captain Rothschild replied with quiet conviction that suggested personal knowledge rather than mere diplomatic assurance, His Royal Highness has asked me to convey his regret that circumstances prevented earlier recognition of his son's existence and his determination to ensure that whatever arrangements are made serve Thomas's long-term happiness rather than merely immediate. Political requirements. The message carried emotional weight that official correspondence could not convey, suggesting that Prince Alexander's summons reflected personal feelings as well as royal duty. But Isabella had learned through bitter experience that royal promises, however sincerely made, were subject to political necessities that could override even the strongest personal commitments. And if Thomas's happiness proves incompatible with royal duty, she asked with maternal protectiveness, that had been strengthened rather than weakened by 6 years of sole responsibility for his welfare, then, Captain Rothschild said with diplomatic honesty that revealed more than he perhaps intended, His Royal Highness will face choices that test everything he believes about the obligations that power creates toward those who cannot protect themselves. As their small party prepared to depart Thornfield Manor for a journey that would end Isabella's exile, while beginning Thomas's introduction to a world of privilege and danger she had hoped to postpone indefinitely, both she and her son understood that their quiet country existence was ending forever. The carriage that would carry them to Montclair Palace represented not just physical transportation, but the bridge between Thomas's protected childhood and whatever future awaited him as Prince Alexander's acknowledged heir. Isabella's secret was about to become public knowledge, but whether that revelation would prove to be salvation or destruction for the family she had built through love and sacrifice remained to be determined by forces beyond her control. "Mama," Thomas said as their carriage pulled away from Thornfield Manor with its gardens and familiar routines disappearing behind them, "will we ever come home again?" "Home," Isabella replied with maternal wisdom that had been hard-won through years of difficult choices, "is wherever our family is together. Thomas, as long as we love each other, we will always have a home." But even as she spoke the reassurances, Isabella was preparing for the possibility that Prince Alexander's acknowledgement of Thomas might require sacrifices that would test whether love could indeed triumph over the political necessities that governed royal marriages and dynastic succession. The journey to Montclair Palace would take 3 days, providing time for Isabella to prepare Thomas for meeting his father, while struggling with her own complex feelings about seeing the man whose love had shaped her life, but whose duty had forced their separation. 6 years of carefully maintained distance was about to end in confrontations that would determine whether their son's royal heritage would prove to be gift or curse for a family that had found happiness through choosing love over convention, but might now be forced to choose convention over everything they had built together. The arrival at Montclair Palace was conducted with ceremonial precision that left no doubt about Prince Alexander's intentions regarding Thomas's status. The boy was received with full royal honors, typically reserved for acknowledged heirs, while Isabella found herself treated as honored guest rather than political inconvenience, despite the irregular circumstances that had brought them to court. Prince Alexander himself waited in the throne room's antechamber, his commanding presence even more formidable than Isabella's memories had suggested, though she could see in his sapphire blue eyes the same intensity that had first drawn her to him 6 years earlier. When Thomas entered beside her, the family resemblance was so unmistakable that even the most skeptical courtier could not question the child's paternity. "Thomas," Prince Alexander said with carefully controlled emotion as he knelt to the boy's eye level, "I am very pleased to finally meet you. Your mother has done remarkable work preparing you to be the kind of young man that any father would be proud to claim." Thomas studied his father's face with the intelligent assessment that characterized his approach to new situations, clearly recognizing something familiar despite their lack of previous acquaintance. "Your Royal Highness," he replied with perfect courtesy that reflected Isabella's careful training in protocol she had hoped he would never need. "Mama has told me that you are someone very important who wanted to meet me. Are you the king?" "Not yet," Prince Alexander replied with gentle humor that surprised Isabella with its naturalness, "but someday I will be, And when that happens, there will be important decisions to make about the future of our kingdom that might affect you as well. The careful phrasing introduced concepts of inheritance and succession without overwhelming Thomas, with implications he was too young to fully understand, demonstrating a paternal sensitivity that Isabella had not dared hope for given the political pressures that typically governed royal family relationships. "Lady Isabella," Prince Alexander continued as he rose to address her directly, "would you consent to private audience where we might discuss Thomas's future with the discretion that such sensitive matters require?" The request was diplomatically phrased, but carried the weight of royal command, and Isabella understood that her compliance was expected rather than merely requested. As Thomas was escorted to chambers that had been prepared for him with every luxury appropriate to his newly acknowledged status, she followed Prince Alexander to his private study, where their first conversation in 6 years would determine their son's destiny. "Isabella," Prince Alexander said once they were alone, dropping royal formality for the intimacy that had once bound them together, "I need you to understand that learning of Thomas's existence has created both the greatest joy and the most complex challenges I have ever faced as either man or prince." "Joy?" Isabella repeated with surprise at hearing personal emotion acknowledged amid circumstances that seemed driven purely by political necessity. "Overwhelming joy," Prince Alexander confirmed with conviction that seemed to surprise him as much as her. "Isabella, discovering that our love created such a remarkable child feels like receiving a gift I had not dared hope for, despite the complications that gift brings to dynastic planning that has been years in development." The reference to dynastic complications reminded Isabella of the political realities that had driven her initial exile and continued to threaten whatever relationship they might attempt to rebuild. "And Princess Sophia of Bavaria?" she asked, with careful control of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her composure. "I understand that your engagement has been formalized and that wedding preparations have begun." Prince Alexander's expression darkened with obvious frustration at constraints that duty imposed upon personal desires he had been forced to suppress for political reasons. "My engagement to Princess Sophia serves diplomatic necessities that affect Valdoria's security and independence," he replied with bitter honesty about arrangements that clearly provided no personal satisfaction. "But discovering that I have a son changes the entire calculus of dynastic succession and royal marriage requirements." Isabella felt her heart racing as she began to understand implications that went far beyond simple acknowledgement of Thomas's paternity. If Prince Alexander chose to legitimize his son as heir, the political necessity for marriage to Princess Sophia might be reduced or eliminated entirely, creating possibilities for personal choice that royal duty had previously forbidden. "What changes does Thomas's legitimization create?" she asked with growing hope and terror at possibilities she had not dared consider. "It creates," Prince Alexander said with decision that had clearly been building throughout the time since learning of his son's existence, "alternatives to dynastic planning that sacrifices personal happiness for political convenience." "Isabella, if Thomas becomes my acknowledged heir, I would no longer require marriage to foreign princess to secure succession that serves Valdoria's interests." The implications struck her speechless. Prince Alexander was suggesting that acknowledging Thomas might provide him with freedom to make personal choices about marriage that had been impossible while securing the succession remained dependent upon diplomatically advantageous unions. "Are you proposing," she said with careful hope, "that Thomas's legitimization might affect your marriage arrangements with Princess Sophia?" "I am proposing," Prince Alexander replied with growing conviction about decisions that would transform multiple lives, "that legitimizing Thomas while marrying his mother would provide Valdoria with the dynastic security it requires while allowing me to choose love over political expedience for the first time in my life." The marriage proposal struck Isabella with emotional force that left her momentarily unable to respond. Prince Alexander was offering not just acknowledgement of their son, but partnership that would transform her from exile into queen, while providing Thomas with both parents and legitimate inheritance of the throne. "Alexander," she said with wonder at possibilities that seemed too perfect to be real, "are you certain that such arrangements would serve Valdoria's interests as well as our personal happiness? Marriage to Princess Sophia would bring diplomatic advantages that union with me could never provide." "Marriage to you would bring advantages that diplomatic alliances cannot create," Prince Alexander corrected with warmth that had been building throughout their conversation. "Isabella, you have proven yourself capable of raising the kind of heir that Valdoria needs, while providing me with partnership that serves both love and duty simultaneously." Before Isabella could respond to declarations that exceeded her most optimistic hopes, urgent knocking at the study door announced interruptions that would test whether their personal desires could indeed overcome political realities that had shaped both their lives for years. "Your Royal Highness," came the voice of Lord Chancellor Pemberton, Prince Alexander's chief advisor, "urgent dispatches have arrived from Bavaria requiring immediate attention regarding wedding arrangements and diplomatic protocols." The timing was clearly not coincidental. News of Isabella and Thomas's arrival at court would have reached interested parties throughout the diplomatic community, creating pressures that might force Prince Alexander to choose between personal desires and political necessities before adequate preparation could ensure success for either approach. "Send word that I am occupied with family matters that take precedence over diplomatic correspondence," Prince Alexander replied with authority that surprised Isabella with its absolute confidence. "Your Royal Highness," Lord Chancellor Pemberton persisted with obvious anxiety about the implications of delaying responses to Bavarian communications, "Princess Sophia's father has expressed concerns about reports regarding your expanded family circumstances. He requests immediate clarification of your intentions regarding previously established marriage agreements." The diplomatic crisis was developing exactly as Isabella had feared. Acknowledging Thomas would indeed create international complications that could affect Valdoria's foreign relations, while potentially destroying carefully negotiated alliances that served the kingdom's security interests. "Alexander," she said with growing alarm at consequences that extended far beyond their personal happiness, "perhaps we should consider arrangements that acknowledge Thomas without disrupting your existing diplomatic commitments. His legitimization might be possible without requiring changes to your marriage plans." "Absolutely not," Prince Alexander replied, with steel beneath his diplomatic courtesy. "Isabella, I will not acknowledge our son while condemning myself to marriage that honors political convenience over genuine partnership. Thomas deserves parents who choose each other freely, rather than accepting arrangements imposed by others' expectations. And if that choice creates diplomatic crises that threaten Valdoria's independence," Isabella asked with maternal concern that extended beyond their family to encompass the kingdom, whose welfare might depend upon decisions they were contemplating. "Then," Prince Alexander said with decision that had clearly been building since learning of his son's existence, "we will face those crises as partners whose commitment to each other provides strength sufficient to overcome whatever challenges our enemies can devise." As they prepared to face diplomatic warfare that would test whether love could indeed triumph over political convenience, while protecting both their son's inheritance and their kingdom's security, both understood that the next few days would determine not just their personal future, but the kind of legacy they would leave for Thomas when he eventually inherited the throne they were fighting to preserve for him. The secret Isabella had guarded for 6 years was about to become the catalyst for choices that would reshape not just their family, but the political landscape of an entire kingdom whose future depended upon whether its prince possessed courage sufficient to choose love over duty when the two seemed irreconcilably opposed. The diplomatic crisis that followed Prince Alexander's decision to acknowledge Thomas while proposing marriage to Isabella tested every alliance that Valdoria had carefully built over decades of strategic matrimonial politics. The Bavarian court's outrage at the broken engagement was matched by French and Austrian concerns about precedents that might affect their own dynastic planning, while internal nobles questioned whether personal desires should override established diplomatic protocols. "Your Royal Highness," Lord Chancellor Pemberton reported with obvious stress during their morning conference, "Ambassador von Habsburg has delivered formal protest from the Austrian Emperor regarding your decision to abandon established agreements for romantic entanglements that serve personal whim rather than state interests." The language is diplomatically precise, but substantively threatening. Prince Alexander received these reports with controlled authority that concealed profound concern about the international isolation that his choices might create for Valdoria. But his determination to protect both Thomas's inheritance and Isabella's position had only strengthened as he observed their remarkable partnership in helping his son adjust to court life while maintaining the loving relationship that 6 years of exile had created. And Bavaria's specific demands? He asked with practical focus on immediate challenges rather than long-term speculation about diplomatic consequences. Complete restoration of previous marriage agreements, formal disavowal of any alternative matrimonial arrangements, and symbolic compensation for the diplomatic humiliation that Princess Sophia has suffered through public rejection, Lord Chancellor Pemberton replied grimly. The demands were clearly designed to force Prince Alexander into choices between personal happiness and political survival that would demonstrate to other European powers whether Valdoria could be trusted to honor agreements regardless of changed circumstances. Isabella, who had been reviewing reports about Thomas's educational progress with his new tutors, felt growing guilt about the international complications that her presence at court was creating for people whose loyalty to Prince Alexander should not be tested by consequences of her decisions to flee 6 years earlier. "Alexander," she said during their private evening discussion in the royal family quarters, where Thomas was already sleeping peacefully in chambers that had been prepared with every comfort appropriate to his acknowledged status. "Perhaps I should consider returning to England with Thomas until these diplomatic pressures can be resolved through methods that don't require your personal sacrifice." "Absolutely not," Prince Alexander replied with immediate rejection of any suggestion that would separate him from the family he had discovered. "Isabella, Thomas is my heir, and you are the woman I choose to marry. Neither of those facts will change regardless of whatever pressure foreign courts attempt to exert. But if those pressures threaten Valdoria's security," Isabella began. "They threaten Valdoria's security less than marriage to Princess Sophia would threaten my ability to rule effectively," Prince Alexander interrupted with conviction that had been building throughout weeks of observing how naturally Isabella had assumed responsibilities that would eventually make her queen. The observation was accurate. Isabella's intelligence, natural authority, and genuine concern for others had already made her popular among court staff and government officials who appreciated her attention to details that pure diplomatic marriage could not address. "Say, Your Royal Highness," Thomas announced as he appeared in the sitting room doorway, wearing the elegant nightgown that had replaced his simple country clothing, "I had the most wonderful dream about riding horses and learning swordwork in the castle's training yards. Will those dreams come true tomorrow?" "They will indeed," Prince Alexander assured his son, with paternal pride that had been growing daily as he discovered Thomas's remarkable capabilities and character. "Colonel Morrison will begin your military training tomorrow morning, while Master Francesco will continue your riding instruction in the afternoon. And Mama will continue teaching me languages and history," Thomas asked with 6-year-old concern for maintaining the educational routine that had characterized his entire conscious existence. "Mama will continue teaching you everything she believes important for your education," Prince Alexander confirmed, with recognition that Isabella's influence on Thomas's development had been invaluable and should continue regardless of whatever formal tutors might be added to supplement her instruction. As Thomas returned to his chambers with excitement about the expanded opportunities that royal acknowledgement was providing, both parents understood that their son's adjustment to court life was proceeding far more smoothly than the diplomatic challenges that their choices had created for Valdoria's international relations. "Isabella," Prince Alexander said as they reviewed correspondence that documented the full scope of foreign disapproval their marriage would represent, "I need you to understand that whatever pressures we face, Thomas's welfare will always take precedence over political convenience." "And my welfare?" she asked with vulnerability that reflected fears about becoming the focus of international hostility that could make her position at court untenable. "Your welfare is inseparable from Thomas's welfare and my own happiness," Prince Alexander replied with warmth that had been growing throughout weeks of rediscovering partnership that political pressures had forced them to abandon 6 years earlier. Their intimate conversation was interrupted by urgent sounds from the castle's main courtyard, the arrival of visitors whose timing and formal escort suggested official business that could not be postponed despite the late hour. "Your Royal Highness," Captain Rothschild announced as he entered with obvious concern about the implications of unexpected diplomatic arrival, "Prince Wilhelm of Prussia has arrived with formal escort and documents that he claims require immediate royal attention." The Prussian presence was both unexpected and potentially decisive. If Prince Wilhelm was representing broader German interests in opposing Valdoria's changed matrimonial arrangements, the diplomatic isolation that Prince Alexander faced could become comprehensive enough to threaten the kingdom's independence. "What documents does Prince Wilhelm carry?" Isabella asked with growing alarm at the possibility that her presence at court was creating threats to Valdoria that went far beyond hurt feelings or damaged wedding plans. Proposals for alternative diplomatic arrangements that would address concerns about matrimonial precedents while providing Valdoria with security guarantees that compensate for lost Bavarian alliance. Captain Rothschild replied with obvious relief that the Prussian mission appeared constructive rather than punitive. Prince Alexander felt profound satisfaction at receiving evidence that not all European powers viewed his personal choices as incompatible with effective diplomatic relationships. Prince Wilhelm's willingness to negotiate alternative arrangements suggested that Valdoria's strategic value might indeed be sufficient to overcome objections to unconventional royal marriage. "Inform Prince Wilhelm that I will receive him tomorrow morning after appropriate preparation for discussions that may affect our kingdom's future relationships with German states," Prince Alexander commanded, with decision that balanced respect for Prussian concerns with assertion of royal authority over Valdorian domestic affairs. As news of Prussian diplomatic flexibility reached court officials who had been preparing for comprehensive international isolation, both Prince Alexander and Isabella began to understand that their choices might indeed be politically viable if they possessed sufficient courage to negotiate new alliances that honored both personal happiness and national security. "Does this mean we can stay together?" Thomas asked the next morning as he overheard adult conversations about diplomatic negotiations that might affect whether his family could remain united. "It means," Prince Alexander replied with paternal authority that carried absolute conviction, "that we are fighting to ensure our family stays together, regardless of whatever obstacles others might attempt to create." "And if we win the fight?" Thomas asked with six-year-old directness about outcomes that adults preferred to discuss in more diplomatic language. "When we win the fight," Isabella corrected with maternal confidence that reflected growing understanding of her own strength and Prince Alexander's commitment to their partnership. "You will grow up knowing that your parents chose love over convenience, while building a kingdom worthy of the man you will become." As they prepared for negotiations that would test whether Valdoria could indeed maintain independence, while honoring personal choices that challenged established diplomatic precedents, all three family members understood that their real adventure together was just beginning. The secret that had separated them for 6 years was about to become the foundation for a marriage that would prove personal happiness and political effectiveness could indeed coexist when both parties possessed sufficient determination to defend what they had built together against whatever enemies might seek to destroy it. The final confrontation over Prince Alexander's matrimonial choices took place in Montclair Palace's Great Hall, where representatives from Bavaria, Austria, France, and Prussia gathered to determine whether Valdoria's strategic importance was sufficient to override objections to a royal marriage that challenged established diplomatic protocols throughout Europe. The assembled nobles represented not just personal disapproval, but systematic pressure designed to force Prince Alexander into choosing between love and political survival. Prince Wilhelm of Prussia served as unofficial moderator for proceedings that would determine whether alternative alliances could compensate for the Bavarian anger that Prince Alexander's rejection of Princess Sophia had created. His presence suggested that German states were prepared to support Valdoria if appropriate concessions could be negotiated, but also that such support would require guarantees that unconventional royal marriages would not establish precedents affecting broader European matrimonial politics. "Your Royal Highness," Ambassador von Habsburg announced with formal displeasure that barely concealed Austrian threats about the consequences of setting dangerous precedents, "the Emperor wishes to express profound concern about arrangements that prioritize personal preference over diplomatic stability that has taken decades to establish." "Ambassador von Habsburg," Prince Alexander replied with controlled authority that demonstrated his preparation for exactly such challenges, "Valdoria has consistently honored all diplomatic agreements that serve mutual interests while reserving sovereignty over internal matters that affect succession and domestic governance." "But surely," Princess Marie-Claire of France interjected with the sophisticated pressure that characterized French diplomatic intervention. Your Royal Highness understands that royal marriages affect international relationships in ways that transcend merely domestic concerns. Your choices create precedents that could destabilize carefully balanced alliance systems throughout the continent. The accusation struck at the heart of fears that had motivated international opposition to Prince Alexander's acknowledgement of Thomas while proposing marriage to Isabella. If other royal heirs followed similar examples by choosing love over diplomatic necessity, the entire structure of European politics could be fundamentally altered. Before Prince Alexander could respond to these broad allegations about continental stability, Isabella herself stepped forward with dignity that commanded attention despite her obviously precarious position as the woman whose presence had precipitated this international crisis. Your Royal Highnesses, she said with composure that impressed everyone present, despite their obvious prejudice against her irregular status, perhaps I might address concerns about precedents by clarifying exactly what precedents my marriage to Prince Alexander would actually establish. What precedents could a marriage between a prince and a... Ambassador von Habsburg paused with diplomatic reluctance to specify exactly what he considered Isabella's status to be. A marriage between a prince and the mother of his legitimate heir, Isabella continued with quiet strength, that transformed potential insult into affirmation of her position. A marriage that legitimizes existing succession while providing the prince with partnership that enables rather than constrains effective governance. Legitimizes existing succession, Prince Wilhelm repeated, with growing interest in possibilities that had not been fully explored in previous diplomatic discussions. Lady Isabella, are you suggesting that your son's legitimization actually strengthens rather than complicates Valdorian dynastic security? I am suggesting, Isabella replied, with conviction that had been building throughout weeks of observing Thomas's remarkable adaptation to royal responsibilities, that Prince Thomas represents exactly the kind of heir that Valdoria needs, someone whose education and character have been shaped by love and careful attention rather than mere protocol and political calculation. The observation was difficult to refute. Thomas's obvious intelligence, natural authority, and genuine goodness had impressed every courtier who had observed his behavior since arriving at the palace. Moreover, Prince Alexander added with growing satisfaction at Isabella's masterful presentation of their case, marriage to Lady Isabella provides Valdoria with exactly the kind of queen that effective governance requires, someone whose intelligence and dedication have already proven themselves through 6 years of single-handedly preparing my heir for the responsibilities he will inherit. But the diplomatic complications, Princess Marie-Claire began, are outweighed by the diplomatic advantages that genuine partnership provides. Prince Alexander interrupted with authority that brooked no argument. Your Royal Highness, effective governance requires more than mere alliance maintenance. It requires leadership that serves subjects' welfare, while building strength that earns rather than simply inherits respect. Before the foreign representatives could respond to this systematic dismantling of their objections, unexpected sounds from the Great Hall's entrance announced arrivals that would transform the entire diplomatic equation. Thomas himself entered with the confident bearing that marked him unmistakably as royal heir, followed by Captain Rothschild, who carried documentation that would provide the final argument in favor of arrangements that served both personal happiness and political necessity. Your Royal Highness, Captain Rothschild announced with obvious satisfaction, I bear correspondence from King Leopold of Belgium expressing support for Valdoria's matrimonial arrangements while proposing military alliance that would strengthen both kingdoms' security interests. The Belgian offer was strategically brilliant. It provided Valdoria with continental alliance that compensated for Bavarian hostility while demonstrating that Prince Alexander's choices had indeed earned rather than merely inherited international support. Additionally, Thomas said with 6-year-old directness that cut through diplomatic complexity to reach essential truths, I wanted to tell these important people that Mama and Papa make each other happy, and happy parents make better rulers than sad ones. The innocent observation struck the assembled diplomats with force that sophisticated arguments could not achieve. Thomas had articulated the fundamental principle that effective governance required personal fulfillment rather than mere duty-driven compliance with external expectations. From the mouths of babes, Prince Wilhelm observed with growing appreciation for wisdom that political calculation often overlooked. "Your Royal Highness, perhaps young Prince Thomas has identified considerations that we have allowed protocol to obscure." "What considerations?" Ambassador von Habsburg asked, with obvious reluctance to acknowledge that a child might provide insights that experienced diplomats had missed. "The consideration," Prince Wilhelm replied with decision that had clearly been building throughout the proceedings, "that genuine partnership between rulers provides strength that arranged marriages cannot create. Your Royal Highnesses, I propose that we support Prince Alexander's choices while negotiating alliance structures that serve everyone's security interests." The Prussian endorsement was decisive. If German states supported Valdoria despite unconventional royal marriage, Austrian and French opposition would become isolated rather than representative of broader European opinion. "Prince Wilhelm," Prince Alexander said with profound gratitude for support that would make their family's survival possible, "Valdoria would welcome alliance negotiations that honor both personal choice and political necessity." "Then," Princess Marie-Claire said with obvious reluctance to accept arrangements she had come to oppose, "perhaps France might also consider alternative diplomatic relationships that acknowledge changed circumstances while maintaining friendship between our kingdoms." As the international crisis resolved, through recognition that Prince Alexander's choices served effective governance rather than mere personal indulgence, Isabella felt profound relief that their family would indeed be allowed to remain together while serving Valdoria's interests. "Alexander," she said as the foreign representatives departed to begin alliance negotiations that would reshape European diplomatic relationships, "are we truly free to marry without destroying the kingdom you've spent your life preparing to rule?" "We are free," Prince Alexander replied with conviction that encompassed everything they had fought to preserve, "to build the kind of partnership that makes both marriage and governance more effective because they're based on genuine choice rather than mere obligation." "And Thomas?" Isabella asked with maternal concern for their son's adjustment to the political complexities that royal acknowledgement had brought into his young life. "Thomas," Prince Alexander said with paternal pride that had been growing since first meeting his remarkable son, "will grow up knowing that his parents chose love over convenience, while proving that personal happiness and political effectiveness can indeed coexist when both parties possess courage sufficient to defend what matters most." As they embraced in the great hall where their love had triumphed over international pressure designed to keep them apart, all three family members understood that their real adventure together was just beginning. The secret that had separated them for 6 years had become the catalyst for choices that would prove personal courage could indeed reshape not just individual lives, but international relationships when combined with determination to protect love that had proven worthy of any sacrifice. The wedding of Prince Alexander and Lady Isabella took place 6 weeks later in Montclair Palace's ancient cathedral, conducted with royal magnificence that honored both their love story and the diplomatic triumph that their union represented. The ceremony drew attendance from throughout Europe, as nobles who had initially opposed their marriage came to witness an alliance that had reshaped continental politics while demonstrating that personal choice and political wisdom could indeed serve mutual interests. Isabella wore a gown of ivory silk, embroidered with the sapphire and gold that marked her as future Queen of Valdoria, while the ancient crown jewels provided sparkle that seemed to reflect the happiness radiating from both bride and groom. Prince Alexander appeared in full ceremonial regalia, his commanding presence lending gravity to vows that formalized feelings tested by 6 years of separation and international pressure. Thomas served as ring-bearer, his small figure dignified by the royal regalia that marked his acknowledged status as Crown Prince of Valdoria. At 7 years old, he possessed perfect understanding that this ceremony would secure his family's unity while providing him with the father he had always deserved, but never hoped to claim. "Do you, Alexander Edward Montclair, Crown Prince of Valdoria, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold as your consort and queen through whatever challenges may come, until death do you part?" "I do," Prince Alexander replied, his sapphire blue eyes never leaving Isabella's face as he made vows that carried both personal and political weight far beyond their immediate legal significance. "Do you, Isabella Catherine Fairmont, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love, honor, and serve beside him as his queen and partner, through whatever trials may test your union, until death do you part?" "I do," Isabella said clearly, her voice carrying across the cathedral to every witness present, as she committed herself not just to Prince Alexander, but to the kingdom they would rule together, while raising the son whose existence had made their love possible. The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed by applause that echoed through the cathedral's ancient walls. But the most meaningful response came from Thomas, who clapped his hands with delight and called out, "Now we're a real family forever." The wedding celebration continued for 3 days, as European nobility gathered to honor a union that had demonstrated how personal courage could indeed reshape international relationships when combined with wisdom that served both love and political necessity. "Your Majesty," Prince Wilhelm said during the state banquet that concluded the formal ceremonies, addressing Isabella with the royal title that she would officially assume upon Prince Alexander's coronation, "Your influence on these proceedings has proven that effective diplomacy sometimes requires feminine wisdom that male political calculation overlooks." Isabella accepted these congratulations with grace that reflected her growing confidence in her ability to serve as queen, while maintaining the natural warmth that had made her effective with everyone from Thomas to international diplomats. The months following their wedding brought challenges that tested Isabella's adjustment to queenly responsibilities, while demonstrating Prince Alexander's remarkable effectiveness as a ruler whose personal happiness enhanced rather than compromised his political judgment. "Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Pemberton reported with obvious satisfaction during one of their regular governance reviews, "the alliance negotiations with Belgium and Prussia have resulted in trade agreements that will significantly strengthen Valdoria's economic independence while providing military security that compensates for any diplomatic losses from the Bavarian estrangement." Isabella had indeed found deep satisfaction in using her position to address domestic issues that previous royal administrations had overlooked, while her influence on international diplomacy had proven invaluable in maintaining relationships that served Valdoria's long-term interests. "And Thomas's education?" she asked with maternal concern that royal responsibilities had not diminished her attention to her son's continuing development. "Proceeding remarkably well," Prince Alexander replied with paternal pride that had been growing since first witnessing Thomas's capabilities. Master Giovanni reports that his linguistic abilities exceed those of most university students, while Colonel Morrison says his military training demonstrates natural leadership that promises exceptional effectiveness when he eventually assumes command. The successful integration of Thomas into royal education, while maintaining the loving family relationships that had been established during his early childhood, represented the triumph of personal values over political pressures that might have demanded sacrifice of either academic excellence or emotional security. 1 year after their wedding, Dr. Morrison brought news that would add another dimension to their happiness, while confirming that their marriage had indeed provided the stability that both personal contentment and effective governance required. "Your Majesties," he announced with obvious pleasure, "I am delighted to inform you that Queen Isabella is expecting a child. Based on my examination, delivery can be anticipated in late spring." The news filled both Alexander and Isabella with joy that felt like confirmation that their love had not just survived political challenges, but had created the foundation for a growing family that would serve Valdoria's future while providing Thomas with siblings who would share both his royal heritage and the security of parents who had chosen each other freely. "Thomas," Isabella said as they shared the news with their son in the royal family quarters that had become home for all of them, "how do you feel about becoming a big brother to the new prince or princess?" "I think it will be wonderful," Thomas replied with 7-year-old excitement about expanded family responsibilities. "I can teach the baby everything Mama taught me about being brave and kind and smart." The maturity in his response demonstrated how completely he had absorbed the values that Isabella had worked to instill throughout his early childhood, while his enthusiasm about sharing those values with siblings showed the generosity that would make him an effective ruler when he eventually inherited the throne. The birth of Princess Catherine Elizabeth Montclair occurred on a brilliant May morning that seemed to celebrate new beginnings and the completion of their family's transformation from secret love to royal dynasty. Prince Alexander held his daughter with wonder that made him appear younger than his years, while Isabella's radiant happiness reflected joy that no previous struggles could diminish. "She's perfect," Alexander murmured, as he settled beside Isabella's bed with the tiny princess whose existence proved that their love had created something beautiful and lasting. "Isabella, thank you for having the courage to return to court, despite the risks, and for proving that our family's love is strong enough to overcome any challenge." "Thank you," Isabella replied with exhaustion that could not dampen her overwhelming gratitude, "for acknowledging Thomas despite the political complications, and for building a kingdom with me that honors both duty and personal happiness." Thomas, now 8 years old and possessed of the natural authority that marked him as unmistakably royal heir, appeared in the doorway with flowers he had picked from the royal gardens to welcome his new sister. "Mama, Papa," he said with the confidence that had been growing throughout his adjustment to court life, "I promised Princess Catherine that I would always protect her and teach her everything important about being royal and kind." As the three adults who had fought to preserve their family's unity gathered around the newest member of their dynasty, all understood that their story had evolved from desperate secret to public triumph, while proving that love could indeed serve political interests when both parties possessed sufficient courage to defend their choices against whatever opposition might arise. 2 years later, as Queen Isabella held their infant son, Prince Edward, while watching Thomas help Catherine take her first steps across the royal nursery, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them from 6 years of painful separation to the secure happiness of a family whose love had reshaped not just their own lives, but international relationships throughout Europe. "Alexander," she said as he joined them in the nursery that had been designed to provide their children with everything they would need to grow up both royal and loved, "do you ever regret the political complications that acknowledging Thomas created? The diplomatic challenges that our marriage required us to overcome?" "Never," Alexander replied immediately, gathering his wife and children into an embrace that symbolized everything they had built together. "Isabella, those challenges proved that our love was strong enough to survive any test while creating the kind of family that makes both marriage and governance more meaningful." "And what we have now?" she asked, though her smile suggested confidence in whatever future they would create together. "What we have now," Alexander said with satisfaction that encompassed their entire transformed existence, "is proof that sometimes the most important secrets are the ones that eventually become the foundation for the most beautiful truths." As they stood together in the royal nursery, surrounded by children who would grow up secure in their parents' love, while understanding that their privilege created obligations to serve others, all 5 family members represented victory over forces that had sought to keep them apart. The secret that had separated them for 6 years had become the catalyst for a love story that would be remembered as proof that personal courage could indeed triumph over political convention when combined with determination to protect what mattered most, regardless of the cost such protection might require. 25 years after Lady Isabella had first fled Valdoria, with Prince Alexander's child growing in her womb, Queen Isabella stood on the balcony of Montclair Palace, watching her eldest son, Thomas, now 31 and a skilled diplomat in his own right, practice his coronation speech in the gardens below. King Alexander had announced his intention to abdicate in favor of his son, confident that Thomas's education and character had prepared him to rule with the wisdom and compassion that Valdoria's future would require. The intervening decades had transformed both their kingdom and their family into showcases of enlightened governance, while their marriage had become legendary throughout Europe as proof that royal unions based on genuine love could indeed serve political interests more effectively than mere diplomatic arrangements. "Mama," Princess Catherine observed as she joined her mother on the balcony, her 24-year-old eyes bright with intelligence and diplomatic skill that had made her one of Europe's most sought-after negotiators. "Thomas seems particularly focused on the sections of his speech dealing with international cooperation. Is this connected to the new alliance proposals he's been developing?" "Your brother understands," Isabella replied with maternal pride that had deepened over years of watching their children develop into leaders of exceptional capability and character. "That effective governance in our modern world requires partnerships that transcend traditional national boundaries while protecting each kingdom's sovereignty." The reference to Thomas's innovative approach to international relations was deliberate. All 3 children had grown up understanding that their family's unconventional beginning had taught them valuable lessons about balancing personal conviction with political necessity that would guide their own leadership decisions. King Alexander appeared on the balcony with news that would add another dimension to their family's ongoing influence on European politics and social reform. "My dear," he announced with satisfaction that suggested significant developments, "I've just received correspondence from the Congress of Vienna. Thomas's proposals for international protocols protecting dynastic marriages from external political pressure have been accepted for formal consideration by all major European powers. The achievement represented the culmination of years of careful diplomatic work that Thomas had undertaken to ensure that other royal families would never face the kind of international pressure that had nearly destroyed his parents' chance for happiness." "What specific protections do the protocols establish?" Isabella asked with professional interest that reflected her own continued involvement in diplomatic initiatives that grew from their family's experience. "Complete sovereignty for individual kingdoms over royal marriage decisions," Alexander replied, with obvious pleasure at legislative changes that validated their decades of advocacy for personal choice in dynastic planning. Additionally, formal recognition that effective governance requires rulers whose personal fulfillment enhances rather than compromises their political judgment. As they discussed the practical implications of international reforms they had helped inspire, Prince Edward himself appeared with news that would demonstrate how completely their children had absorbed the values that had guided their parents' approach to leadership and service. "Mama, Papa," he said with the directness that had characterized his approach to important matters since childhood, "I wanted to share the news before you heard it from other sources. The University of Prague has offered me the chair in international law, with specific focus on developing legal frameworks that protect individual rights within monarchical systems. The appointment was both academically prestigious and personally meaningful, representing exactly the kind of career that would utilize Edward's education while serving causes that had shaped his family's understanding of justice and social responsibility." "Edward," Isabella said with the blend of pride and maternal concern that characterized her response to her children's major decisions, "such work would establish you as one of Europe's leading legal scholars, while placing you at the center of potentially controversial debates about royal authority and individual freedom." "Mama," Edward replied with conviction that had been developing throughout his university years, "I am prepared to engage whatever debates arise from work that protects people who need protection. You and Papa taught me that privilege creates obligations to serve justice rather than merely enjoying advantages." Alexander felt profound satisfaction at hearing his son articulate principles that had guided their own family's approach to using power in service of causes that extended far beyond personal comfort or conventional royal responsibilities. "Then you have our complete support," he said with paternal pride that encompassed not just Edward's career choice, but the character development that had made such choices inevitable. Their family conference was interrupted by the arrival of Princess Catherine with news that would provide perfect symmetry to their ongoing commitment to protecting vulnerable members of society. "Papa, Mama," Catherine announced with excitement that characterized her approach to diplomatic achievements, "the International Court has approved my proposal for the Treaty on Matrimonial Consent, formal agreement between 12 European kingdoms establishing that all royal marriages must be based on genuine consent rather than mere political arrangement. The treaty represented exactly the kind of systematic change that would prevent future generations from facing the coercive pressures that had nearly destroyed their own family's chance for happiness." "Catherine," Isabella said with tears of pride in her eyes, "this achievement ensures that other young women will never face the impossible choices that I faced 25 years ago." As the family gathered for their traditional evening meal in the palace's intimate dining room, all 5 members understood that their success in building meaningful lives was rooted in the secret that had brought their parents together, while demonstrating that love defended with sufficient courage could indeed reshape not just individual destinies, but international systems that affected thousands of families. "Isabella," Alexander said as they concluded dinner with discussion of each child's achievements and aspirations, "do you ever regret the years we lost while Thomas was growing up without knowing his father? The sacrifice you made to protect him from political pressures that might have destroyed his childhood?" "Never," she replied immediately, looking around the table at children whose very existence proved that principled choices could indeed create extraordinary blessings. "Alexander, those years of separation taught Thomas independence and strength that conventional royal upbringing could never have provided. Our sacrifice created the foundation for everything precious that followed. And what about the price we paid for choosing love over political convenience? Thomas asked, with mature understanding of the challenges his parents had faced in building their family. Was not a price paid, Isabella replied with conviction, born of decades of reflection on their journey, but investment made in proving that personal integrity and political effectiveness can indeed serve mutual interests when both parties possess sufficient courage to defend their choices. As their children departed to pursue their respective evening activities, Thomas to final preparations for his coronation, Catherine to diplomatic correspondence with international colleagues, Edward to legal research that would influence policy throughout Europe, Alexander and Isabella found themselves alone in the dining room, where so many family decisions had been discussed and celebrated. "Any regrets about revealing the secret that brought us together?" Alexander asked, with the comfortable intimacy that had developed over 25 years of partnership that had begun with crisis but had evolved into profound mutual devotion. "Only that I waited so long to trust that your love was strong enough to overcome whatever political obstacles our happiness might create," Isabella replied with honesty that had characterized their relationship since that first desperate letter had summoned her back to court. As they stood together before the portrait of their family that dominated the dining room's main wall, both understood that their love story would be remembered not just for its dramatic reunion, but for the systematic changes they had inspired to ensure that royal families throughout Europe would be free to choose love over political convenience without sacrificing either personal happiness or effective governance. The secret that had separated them for 6 years had become the foundation for a marriage that proved personal fulfillment, and political wisdom could indeed coexist when both parties possessed sufficient determination to defend what mattered most, while serving causes greater than their own immediate interests. Their children would carry forward understanding that true nobility came from using advantages to protect others who faced similar challenges, while their grandchildren would grow up in a world where the legal and diplomatic reforms their family had championed would make coercive royal marriages increasingly difficult to justify or maintain. Sometimes, they had learned, the most important secrets were the ones that eventually became catalysts for truths so powerful they could reshape not just individual lives, but entire systems of governance, proving that love defended with sufficient courage could indeed change the world one family at a time. The woman who had hidden a prince's heir for 6 years had become the queen whose influence would protect countless families from the kind of political coercion that had once threatened to destroy their own chance for happiness, while demonstrating that sometimes the greatest acts of love were the ones that began with sacrifice but ended with triumph, that benefited not just those who had suffered, but entire generations who would inherit the protections that such courage had created. If you want more stories like this video, and subscribe to support the channel.